curious what anyone's been thinking about on this fine day on any topic whatsoever. I personally have been diving head at the end of Belonging Again 2.2. We talk a lot about growth theories and economics and look at Piketty, look at Stiglitz, look at Robert Solow, and what exactly is growth. And one of the things I love about economics is they go, yeah, growth is really important. Too bad we don't really know what it is. Oh, really? Like if you isolate return on capital, if you isolate return on labor, there's still what's called the Solow residual, which is about 20, probably the low end in the 20s, high end in the kind of 40 to 50, basically this mysterious X factor that they just call productivity. And you go, oh, productivity, you mean labor? No, distinct from labor. That includes like insights and, creativity and increasing efficiency on pre-existing technologies. And you go, oh, well, I guess that's going to be really important to like train people in. Yeah, well, we really don't know how to do that. Oh, okay. So there's this missing kind of piece in a lot of economic theory. Now, something I really like, a book that I really appreciate, and I'm happy to speak about anything on this fine day, Michael, I'll throw it to you, is this Creating a Learning Society by Joseph Stiglitz. He's a Nobel Prize economist. He's quite brilliant. And he's basically trying to take a stab at, okay, what if we were to actually try to figure out what creates growth, right? As opposed to just kind of leaving it this mysterious thing. And by growth, now, of course, I think then we have to get into, well, what is growth? We talking increasing GDP? Are we talking increasing living standards? Are we talking about a few corporations make a lot of money while everyone else doesn't? And then, of course, you have the problem where some growth is zero sum, meaning it benefits some people. And then there's some growth that's non-zero sum. So you get all of those issues. But what I appreciate about Mr. Stiglitz is basically, and I do believe this is correct, the argument they want to make is that free markets are not efficient at basically creativity and innovation, that they don't actually do a good job at innovating. And you would say, what the heck are you talking about? Like, isn't like capitalism all about entrepreneurship and things like that? Well, the issue is the amount of entrepreneur, there's a term they use that I forget that basically means for the amount of productivity you would expect that would be optimal for the system, it's nowhere close to that. I think you don't get the amount of innovation you would expect. And then, of course, the problem is looking at Piketty, the innovation does not seem to change. Returns on capital are larger than growth. Like the amount you make on, say, owning money, owning property, having stocks, that seems to outpace growth, right? And it would not seem as if the innovation that capitalism generates can necessarily overcome the law of R is greater than G. Now, McCloskey, my beloved Dietrich McCloskey, does not think very fondly of this argument. He has many things to say against it, as do the Lithuania Free Market Institute and things like that. We have to get into all that, but a kind of a paragraph that sums it, and then I'll give it to Mr. DeClercq here. And I do think this kind of sums up Stiglitz's argument. And it's a great book. I really do suggest it. If learning and R&D more generally is at the center of the success of an economy. So they make this argument. They're like, learning determines the success of an economy, learning. And if there is no presumption that markets are efficient in making decisions which affect the pace of learning, then longstanding presumptions against government intervention are simply wrong, right? They're like, if markets are not efficient at learning, then maybe the government should intervene in order to help with learning. Now, of course, it could be the case that the market is not efficient at learning and government is really bad at intervening in a manner that helps. Could be the worst of all possible worlds, right? But they're trying to suggest a possibility of making a learning society. Now, there's a lot more to say, but I've been thinking about that. Throw it to Mr. DeClercq and anyone else who wants to speak on this day. Mr. DeClercq, how are you doing today, sir?
I'm doing fantastic. It's good to see everyone. Yeah, I'll go in a different direction, and then maybe I'll try and kind of tie it back to what you were mentioning there, because I do think there is a lot in kind of what I've been thinking, maybe not from an economics lens, but in, I guess, the symptomology of it that's very similar. I've been thinking quite a bit about, and Daniel, you've mentioned this, but I was actually just at this event that was co-hosted by Jacob Pashir, who's a beloved member of the net. Him and his co-facilitator of this collective men's work, so his co-facilitator is also a climate journalist by trade, and so he kind of wanted to merge the kind of rhetoric and discussion on the climate crisis and the meta crisis with masculinity. And so they got all these. They had like a climate journalist on there and a woman who's a psychotherapist and Matthew and Jacob. It was a very interesting discussion. And one of the things that one of the women was talking about is with the invention of the internet, the private space has kind of entered into the public space. There's been kind of a blending of the two. And the kind of, well, there's obviously been many different trends and kind of emergences from that, but one of them has been the kind of, she put it, the feminization of the public space. And I know, Daniel, you talked about that with Michelle before, about how now there's a lot more discussions that are not necessarily solution based or problem solving in nature. They're much more exploratory and creative, and people are bumping up against, their personal limitations, sociocultural limitations. They're learning how to dwell in ambiguity. They're learning how to be, emotionally vulnerable, heart-led, as opposed to kind of, I think what a lot of industrial capitalistic public spheres were dominated with is like a certain expert class who is kind of, oftentimes with very kind of authoritarian means constructing society. And there's kind of the more kind of right brain sensibilities are kind of not really privileged, shunted to the side. And now there's kind of a change in that. And one of the interesting things that she said is that she kind of made a link between that development and the kind of I don't like using sorry. I don't like using the term toxic masculinity, but like that kind of response. There's like a certain strain of the male population that feels like, oh, now everyone wants to talk about their feelings, and I don't like resonate with that. That's not interesting to me. Or it's kind of devaluing the kind of masculine, desire to build, construct, to have answers. And so I've just been thinking about how, because I personally see, and maybe I wouldn't use the term feminization, maybe I would say like creative or artistic evolutions of the public space. I see that as a good thing for men and women. But I've just been thinking about, I guess, certain pitfalls on either side of of um of that, and how can it be generative for men and women, and kind of how to respond to, some of the kind of, you know, manosphere responses to to that. And that, that gets into like scale of, like spaces like this and stuff. But I think it points to what you were talking about, Daniel, which is like spaces like this. I think there's potentially, in this generation, we'll kind of figure out what the fuck the solo residual is. Because now there's like, you can watch the net conversation, anyone can, and you can kind of pick up on the kind of vibe of the conversation, and you can notice a certain energy and certain circulation of ideas that doesn't necessarily, it doesn't necessarily lead to some increase in GDP, but like nevertheless, like you're you're vibing with it. And you're like, huh, like what's going on here? And then you like look into all these people and you're like, wow, they're all like creative people. Like they're all like they're all like writing things or they're building things or they're, like, and what the heck's going on there? But they're not like selling anything to me. Like they're not trying to get me to buy their thing, but there's like, there's like a critical mass of people that I think wake up to the fact that like conversations like this are how creative people create things. And now for the first time, like the internet is broadcasting those what used to be kind of like dark room little, conversations that happen away from the public, square. And so, yeah, like it will be interesting to see if, economists or social scientists or whatever, like start doing research into this, like into the, I don't know, the TLC or something, like a longitudinal study of the TLC. Um, and yeah, maybe the term feminization of the public sphere is, I don't know, maybe an alienating one or something for some people. I know, like, I don't think anyone here would find that problematic, but because I think a lot of it seems like mostly the men of this space are the ones who are asking, the like, well, we're having all these conversations, but like, what now? Like, what do we do? What and some people have like kind of quipped back of like, well, like this is the like actually this is the activity. Like this in and of itself is valuable and culture creating. But I wonder. I don't know. I guess I've just been thinking about like how um masculine and feminine aspects of obviously those aren't just limited to men and women, each of those separately, but like how they can come together in internet kind of third spaces.
No, I think that's absolutely critical. Christian, wonderful to see you, Michelle, Satori. And Satori has some wonderful videos just on this very topic. And Michelle and I talk about this a lot. Well, and this also makes me think of Ivan Illich on the separation of the sexes in the social script that actually leads to a quality of thought that is more prone to Nash equilibrium. And that would have to be explained. But that, he'll talk about how the idea, like it used to be when you look at history, that the idea of the man going off to a job and coming home, that's a newer modern invention. And I think that also changes the qualities of interaction. He's quite fascinating. I think also what you're pointing to, basically, if we ask this question, so everyone I was mentioning, I've been reading Mr. Joseph Stigler on creating a learning society and how in economics there is a giant mystery of what is growth. Now, what is very telling to your point, Michael, is that when many of these people define productivity, how they define productivity turns to be in R&D, technological research, technology is basically what they mean by R&D. And productivity is defined as basically, well, advances in technological thinking. So the technological essence, right? And what I would very strongly argue is that if Dietrich McCloskey is correct, that the Great Enrichment is in fact caused by here's the key, a change in rhetoric, a change in how people spoke to one another, which gave them permission to experiment, be entrepreneurial, and then actually the very way they speak. And she calls it rhetoric, and I've called it voice craft. Now, belonging again, too, is going to talk about how so much of the stakes actually does come down to the quality of how we talk with one another. The Frankfurt School, Adorno, all those caps talk about discourse, which I associate with Kafka-likeness, which is a way of talking that gets us stuck in the Heideggerian technological essence, where we actually then are kind of narrow. And then I would argue, here would be my point, is discourse as such, as a quality of speech, leads to growth being captured by people who own capital. So if R is greater than G in Piketty, if there is discourse in the society and creativity and growth is primarily defined as productivity, then it's narrow. What Tyler Cohn says in his book on the Great Stagnation is that what we have seen is that growth is very private, not very public. That you see private growth, you'll see private sectors that do very well, but you don't have it be very public. Right? And the argument I would make is that this correlates with, to the degree growth is reflected of productivity. Now, the key is I actually would like to argue should be a distinction between productivity and creativity. And creativity, which is the source of value in the socioeconomic system, is actually more reflective of what Dietrich McCloskey is talking about. And it's a giant claim, but it's a dialectic between energy following Vikhoff-Smil, who quite clearly shows that you can correlate a society's GDP with its energy use, which of course could be problematic if it's destroying the climate, but in a dialectic with the ideas that you come up with. And this is actually a form of creativity. To put it more technically, not to go on about it, productivity, what you have in economics is what's called the efficiency frontier, okay? And most sectors of the economy, what people like Kenneth Arrow, Robert Solow all found is very few firms operate on the maximum of their efficiency limit. Like they're not as efficient as they could be. Therefore, most growth just simply goes into making pre-existing firms more efficient. And we call that productivity. That is extremely different, though. Here's my problem with, if I were to tell you my overarching concern, they use the term growth to refer to both the increase of efficiency of a pre-existing firm. They refer to growth as the increase of efficiency of a firm toward its efficiency limit. And there's a more technical term to it. And they conflate that with, say, the invention of the typewriter, the invention of James Joyce, the creativity of you could say a new form, right? Like a form versus an accident. These are not the same. But in the economic numbers, they are reflected as if they are equal. And I think that leads to all sorts of inefficiencies in the system. And my internet is freezing. So let me try to switch it.
Oh, there he is.
I'm so sorry. I'm going to switch to this other thing. So I was just saying, I'll just throw it to you, Christian. Basically, what I'm saying is that growth, approaching your efficiency limit, is the same in growth as creating a new form. And actually, what I think history shows is a culture of creating new forms is more of a conversational space. And that's kind of the irony, is a culture of rhetoric, a culture of conversation structure actually has in history, and I think there's plenty of evidence to show this, is what generates creativity as distinct from production. And then, ironically, to the degree creativity is nothing more than production, growth narrows. And that's kind of the larger argument and reflects, it tends to, that's where R is greater than G in Piketty. That's the argument. But let me pause and throw it to you. Christian, I hope you're doing well.
I only have a brief share. I didn't know what the term or the acronym TLC would have stood for before a couple days ago, but I was just getting home I'm with my parents right now, and my sister, who's 24, lives here as well. And she comes out with her phone as, Christian, you know what TLC is? And I was like, no. And she's like, this little corner of the internet? I'm like, I don't know what that means. And then she holds up her phone, and it's she's got a conversation of you and I, Daniel, pulled up on her YouTube, and she's like, I was just, watching some what's the guy's name who the kind of Christian commentator, Paul Vanderklay. Yeah. She's watching some Paul Vanderklay videos, and Michelle was featured in one. And then I don't know, she followed some rabbit trail and ended up finding me on YouTube, and was very excited about it. Point a little bit that these conversations aren't happening completely in a bubble. They're getting viewed by people all around the world, and maybe helping them think in new ways, feel in new ways. So anyways, I just thought I'd share that.
Well, that's super cool. And well, again, if I'm making, and I'll throw it to Sam here, Stiglitz is arguing that basically growth is dependent on learning. Which in one way you hear and you go, duh, obvious. There's a certain way where you're like, okay, yeah, learning's education, that's really important. But you see, the issue is the question becomes the quality of the learning. And the argument I want to say is that if learning is overly defined in terms of, say, research and design, and not say I'm looking at the Nordic Bildung or the Bildung that Lena Anderson, because you also have that case study of showing when the Nordic nations change their school system, and they're some of the poorest nations in Europe, and then they become some of the richest, right? And that is a very different criteria that Lena is talking about as opposed to what, say, Stiglitz or Cohn or Thiel are talking about, right? And here's the horror, if learning of the wrong quality, if you will, let me just call it R&D learning, although I am not saying R&D is bad. The issue is R&D without the Bildung, if I just use those terms today. Then you tend to get narrow growth, as in growth is concentrated. It's more private than public. That is consequential. And for someone like Keynes, that will lead to social unrest and extreme politics. And you could argue you're already seeing that around the world and so on and so forth, conflict, war, and so on. So the question of the quality of the learning is really, really important. And what's just very interesting is if you look at my beloved, I'll remember his name in a minute, Randall Collins' Theory of Intellectual Change, Lena Anderson, McCloskey, and all these people, and I think Tocqueville as well, and I'll throw it to Sam, it literally, the way people talk about, the way, like, being learned more orally, and through conversation, the ability to actually deal with subjectivity and people with science. I'm not saying against science. I think Paul Feyerabend shows quite clearly that many of the great scientists do this very thing. I mean, that's a big thing with Against Method by Feyerabend. He thinks we have a complete misunderstanding of where scientific breakthrough comes in. We think it's this quiet consensus. No, it's these madmen who have these ideas like Galileo that are fighting for it, having conversations with the Pope. And like Einstein is having reading groups every Friday on David Hume and different people like that. So that culture of engagement is an extremely big deal. And I think for me, the social coordination mechanism as the SEM is the dialectical assist to the pricing mechanism of height that will actually enable a growth and spread of subjectivity that can allow growth to be larger than returns on capital, and that growth actually reflect creativity, not just productivity, which means the gains of growth will be more public than private. Now, I have to argue, now, again, there are people like McCloskey and other more on, I want to say, an Austrian side that will take some issues with this claim. But so that work has to be done. But there's a lot of my thinking is there. But let me throw it to Sam here. Sam, I hope you're doing well. It's wonderful to have you.
Hi. Yeah, okay. I think this is interesting. Initially, when you said what is growth, I thought you meant like what is natural growth initially. So it was a sort of funny way to be primed for what you were about to say. But I think like I feel like I am, because of my current reading and also the things that have been on my mind, I'm tempted to like try and like furnish this thought process with a few more things, like one of which, like, I think, like when we set to figure out or just work on or consider something, we sort of set a scope around the project and we sort of like operate within that scope. Like we can be very good at, as Western thinkers, is like putting on blinders and sort of like decoupling the scope that we've set out to work upon from its like, hence being in the world, hence, Heidegger's call. And I think what I'm hearing going on here is like, yeah, we presuppose that productivity is like creativity, and so we presuppose that it's this quiet efficiency increase. But when we look on the ground, we see it's more madmen. And then when we try and look at the terrain in which these madmen are creating, like I think it's a bit too weak of an argument to really say that creativity is good or something. Like everything has an opportunity cost, and you can spend a large portion of your life being very creative and it having no real terrain in which to take root, right? Like you're just germinating seeds and it's creative, but it's like no tree grows from that. So like, I think it's important to be a little critical and not just be like, creativity is great. Because it's like, that we do operate in a world which is, I mean, a friend shared this on Substack the other day, like this great scandal of the world. I can't remember things right now. I recently had a bit of a tumble and I hit my head. But it's like the great scandal of the world is like that things aren't as good as they could be, or something to that effect. But it's like, yeah, we should always remember that, like when we're looking around, like we can be creative, but are we like, there's a sort of ecology and terrain to what creativity is and how it changes the world. And like it has a relationship to productivity. And often one little germination of creativity requires like 100 years in a soil bed and a lot of water to create the tree that it's destined to be or potentialed to be. So like, like I think a lot of people, like I think there are a lot of really good creative re-seeings of the world that just get buried into books or just get buried onto YouTube or something. Like they don't like find the right habitats to be the best tree that they could be. And then when I think of myself, like, I mean, each of us are people and we lead productive lives and we lead creative lives, but like, unless the two are sort of like coordinating and growing each other, it feels a little, it feels like there's some potential being left on the table. I think sometimes like, you know, in some life ways, life models, maybe the most productive thing you ever do is like care for a child, or you know, like there's plenty of like work in the world that is merely like, but is just compassionate. And like I think just like the sort of germination of that very fruitful life might just be like a simple realization of the value of others in a brief moment of insight. But like there's got to be some sort of communication there. And like I think what you see with millennials is we do live these really fractured lives. Like I think it seems apparent that like something is really reorganizing the world as it is with the advent of information technology. And so you see like millennial lives where like my best friend lives in a different city and my other best friend lives in a different city and my mom lives in a different city and my brother lives in a different city and we all talk on the phone, you know? And it's like, and you know, like I recently like broke my elbow and it's like, you know, I can't just go over to my mom's place and get her to wash my hair or something like that, you know, like, and so like we're in the middle of this kind of, like it feels like fragmentation, but it might just be the beginning of a phase of like a phase shift, a reorganization. I mean, that's kind of the thought that I harbor, but who really knows? Anyways, I'm rambling a bit, but I think there's something about like the terrain in which the ecology of creativity and productivity take place. Because I think if those sort of cultures, like the culture that is the organism, that is the creative spark, and the culture that is the environment, and you know, like the culture that is the productivity that sort of like enables it, it's like all of those things have to have a sort of higher order to them, or higher harmony for us to even have this kind of a talk about like what is growth, because it's like yeah, because there's just so many unfruitioned dreams in the world, I guess is what the point I'm trying to make.
Not rambling at all. And goodness, I'm sorry about your elbow and your head. And golly, I hope you feel better. That's no fun. No, everything you said right there is fantastic. I'll throw it to Greg and Michael. For me, and I completely agree as well that this moment has a certain potentiality. I do like when Hegel sort of describes as if these, there's these ideas of history is progressive, but that if there's a future, it's better than the past, but that doesn't mean there's going to be a future. Like, because there's a contingency, but there is a reason to think that if the world is the way the world is now, then there was good reason why it got this way. Now, that doesn't mean there was perfect knowledge and there wasn't mistakes and et cetera, so forth. But if you assume that, the right course is going backwards, that's kind of problematic, because you're actually sort of suggesting you have insight beyond the collective intelligence of every individual of moments leading to this current point, right? Like I can tell you there can be some sort of nostalgia for the past, but the amount of work it takes to just like run a freaking garden with raised beds, let alone your entire diet. I mean, my gosh, I can't even imagine. So there's good reasons the world is the way that it is. The question is, and I look at Hegel for this, what is occurring that is problematic, that needs to be addressed, that could give rise to a sublation, where it's not that you're throwing out productivity, but you're actually sublating it into a quality of growth that is not going to have, say, for Piketty, the return on capital leading to smaller and more narrow bounds, right? And the thing, and then thus increasing non-zero sumness. I think also what you're saying about creativity, I couldn't agree with more. The question becomes, to what degree does the internet provide an environment that helps the quality of creativity, not like suck, and actually translate into productivity? And I actually think what we see often is that the higher the likelihood creativity is actually, I want to say, valuable, is to the degree there's a social environment, like people are meeting, there are groups, there are people to talk with, there are people to read your short stories and check on them, where you have the social dimension, right? And I think Randall Collins shows that. The question becomes, when the internet is used as a social coordination mechanism, to what degree does that increase the probability that creativity in the socioeconomic system can be more valuable and, in a sense, more efficient, so that then a productivity that is overly defined by just research and design, in the way that Stiglitz and them are talking about, which tends to be quantifiable, that's also the major problem, is the way that they are defining productivity. Ivan Illich would say you're leaving out the work of the shadow work. You're leaving out all the work of the person at home taking care of things, the babysitting, the family, without which the society doesn't exist. That doesn't get included in productivity. But without that, the system doesn't work very well, right? And the question becomes, does the social coordination mechanism now actually allow, in working with the pricing mechanism, for a sublation where creativity is now going to be something that people can have a higher chance of actually refining and testing with other people like we're doing now, in order to make it more valuable, that then could work in concert with productivity, that would not be at the expense of those creative possibilities, and instead just narrow them into approaching an efficiency curve. That's what I personally am very interested in, because for me, capitalism had a pricing mechanism through Hayek, which helped us deal with the problem of distributing resources, pricing coordination, all of those different things. But the issue is, if that's all on the side of productivity, we do not have a similar mechanism that makes as fluid and movement as creativity, which is going to be more on the side of subjectivity. But do we now have that? And if we do, that opens, I think, sublative possibilities. And that, I think, is something that it seems to me in the economic literature is desperately needed when they're talking about productivity. So I completely agree with what you're saying about the environment, but I'll throw it to Greg here. Greg, please.
Yeah, I think I mostly want to gently problematize a lot of the premises of this conversation. So Daniel, I think you've distinguished between productivity, and especially like efficiency-based productivity, versus creativity. And there's the concern that economic models don't address creativity enough, and so then something's missing in them. But I'm not sure. Well, so then I want to make a further distinction within what we've been calling creativity in this discussion between, I'm going to say, inventiveness versus creativity. So I'm using inventiveness to mean like inventing new tools and new ways of being productive and new products and things like that. And then creativity is actually like making art and making meaning. And I don't know that making art and making meaning should be economicized at all. And rather than lamenting that they're not represented in that art's not represented in economics and trying to figure out a way to do it, just say like, yeah, we understand that economics addresses one aspect of life and it doesn't address others. And, it's not like we all have signed up to agree to lead our lives by the determinations of economics. It's just, it's over there and this is over here. Um, and um, it occurs to me that, and I'm not an economist, and I haven't, so this is just really off the top of my head, but it occurs to me that economics is for measuring like shared societal experiences, as opposed to individual experiences. So if you are going to try to put art into the models of economics, it seems like you're actually still limiting yourself to art as it has expressed itself through societally available platforms. And that still leaves out what could be an amazing experience that somebody has, writing a song that nobody else ever hears, or just a few of their friends hear, or they're known within a very small coffee house circuit in their community, or things like that. So that's one category. And then the other category, which is something I've raised in kind of these discussions that I've been in before, whether here or like at the philosophy portal, is there seems to be like an accepted lamentation of lack of community, and then an assumption that in-person community has sort of fallen away. And so therefore, to have community, we need to really put energy and intentionality into fostering it in the internet spaces. And I mean, internet spaces are cool, but I guess I just want to challenge and say like, well, yeah, sure. Here we're all on the internet. We're all communicating with each other on the internet. So maybe we're the kind of people, who spend time on the internet. And so that's like a you problem, maybe not a everybody problem. So like in my own case, this morning, I guess I'm rambling for a while, but I'll wrap it up soon. This morning, I was at my twice weekly writing group, and we meet in person, sitting around a table at a cafe. We talk a little bit, check in, and then we spend an hour writing quietly, and then we socialize after that. And these people know the kind of long course of the projects that I'm working on, and we also have just human to human, interaction, everything like that. And then now I'm here and I'm getting things out of this as well. But like, I just would just say like, go out and look for the real life social opportunities. And ultimately, those remain more important to me than the internet stuff, I think. That's all.
Magnificent. I think that's all outstanding. And Cleo, divine to see you. Thank you for coming by. I'll throw it to Michael and Chris. No, I'm very glad you said that. So there's a few things. So for me, ultimately, what the role of creativity as distinct from productivity in economics shows is that economics as a field is quote unquote incomplete in a Gödel sense, that it is actually dependent on something outside the model. It's a radical claim I want to make. I want to say that the moments, and even Piketty will say this, there are rare moments in history where actually growth is bigger than returns on capital. And these actually define the non-zero sumness that then almost like Tyler Cohn talks about, low-hanging fruit, that then much of growth that then follows for a very long time comes from these things. And the issue is that all of them are like, yeah, but we don't know what causes that, and it's kind of, problematic. Well, I think what you can show is actually growth depends on something that is outside of economics, which means that economics, to the degree it is an isolated field and wants to quantify everything, ironically, in the name of productivity and growth, ends up creating the conditions where there is not growth. You need, like, this is the claim, people gathering in their living room to read short stories that no one will hear creates the learning society of the kinds of people that engage in creativity that then allows there to be growth because something is outside the model. Like economics is a field that has always, in my opinion, so let me put it this way. For many economists, the solo residual ends up being something to solve. Like it's a problem, let us solve it. And the way Jochen and I might say it is that they want to show that lack is nothing, that it's not a kind of fundamental lack, it's something we can figure out. I want to argue the solo residual is always outside the model. That if you try to make it quantifiable, you ironically kill the conditions of possibility for a learning society. You kill the possibilities of growth. And so what this means is that economics, in my opinion, to actually generate wealth that is non-zero sum, has to honor the spaces of which are not economic. They have to honor that. They have to acknowledge that they need the literature, they need the arts, they need the philosophy, they need leisure, they need spaces that are not productive. That ironically, those spaces actually create the kinds of people who generate wealth and have higher qualities of life. So I want to ultimately make a kind of Kurt Gödel incompleteness theorem argument about economics that shows these spaces like, you know, we're talking about the social coordination mechanism and Michael, and we were talking about like these kind of conversations as an example that have no economic value. Ironically, I think history shows the economic system is dependent on. It actually because it is outside of modeling and cannot be quantified. But here's the problem. The logic of capital, if we use that line, the logic of markets is to make everything quantifiable. That is its very logic. And what has to happen is there has to be people that basically set limits. Now, what Stiglitz is arguing is that the government and the state has to set those limits. Now, I think his policy, I'm not sure if that would work. I think what has to more so happen is you have to have people that are able to set the limits themselves. Ergo, they value writing a short story and sharing it with friends in a room that never goes to anyone else. Like if you value that and you're just willing to do it, that sets a limit on what the market can influence in your life. And then you have a healthier relationship with the market. And then the argument would be that the market actually generates more growth when people are able to do that, right? And the problem is, I think what I want to argue with Stiglitz is when the limits are from top down, that doesn't necessarily train people to be the kinds of people who are reading short stories alone in their living room and changing the kind of subjectivity that they are. Now, and I think that's key for the residual, not to ultimately become something we're going to concretize and model. And ironically, that I think is going to make worse the inequality and all the other stuff, right? Now, again, I think a lot of what we're talking about here, I think a lot of the debate between like Dietrich McCloskey on more of the Austrian side and Piketty and all of that is that they're lacking, in my opinion, an understanding of a fundamental incompleteness in economics that is reliant on, well, spaces that can't be quantified. And I think then, like you're saying, there can be like, oh, well, let's make art quantifiable. That would ironically make it lose the quality that actually generates wealth in the name of generating wealth. So there are all these ironies that are there. So I'm very glad you said that. And then also, too, I completely agree. If the internet is not used to coordinate in real life as a social coordination mechanism, not a social replacement. It has to be a coordination mechanism where you are able to say, like, if this becomes all you do and not in real life and you're not in a feedback loop, that becomes very, very problematic. Like for me, as an example, it can be very difficult in a place like Rustburg to find people interested in philosophy who want to have a reading group. But if there are videos like that, we can find the others. You can find the others. And a way to kind of, their social coordination mechanism is tied to finding others to open in real life possibilities that otherwise could not occur, right? And I think you have to have it work in that way. I kind of think about it sometimes following Joseph, and then I'll throw it to Michael here. Like Josephina Quinn has a lovely book on the history of the world made the West, on the Silk Roads, on between civilization, between spaces. Dr. Fracopon at Oxford also shows that basically roads are just as important as spaces in making the world, right? And I look at the internet as a kind of road. It's the roads. You need a healthy road system. You need a healthy Silk Road system for interactions, trading of ideas, because otherwise the flow is not, there's not enough movement. And I swallowed a fly. So I think it's important to see both of those, but I'll throw it before I die.
Yes. So I mean, I wouldn't even require us to say the internet ultimately should, only have its value if it leads to people coming together in real life. Like I think that there are opportunities for people to connect over the internet that are fine as like that's the actual connection is on the internet, and there are people with varying degrees of opportunity to do things in real life, and there even people who live like in the middle of a busy city but they have a disability or something like that, and of course the actual experience of connecting over the internet is a value in itself. So I'm not even saying that. I'm just saying let's not universalize individual people's lacks. Um, like, like I guess if my suggestion is just go and find connection and meaning where you find it in real life on the internet or whatever, but like maybe don't make a mission out of solving those problems writ large for everybody. It's like there's not going to be a one size fits all. It's just up to each person to make it work for them. And that's all that they don't need help. And we don't need to help that. We just all need to do stuff that's cool and fun and interesting.
I think that's very well said. And ironically, I think if you have a preset of idea of what to do with people, then you have that kind of efficiency sort of structure that actually can kind of kill the environment, that actually brings people out. I think that's very, very true. For me, basically with the social coordination, it creates optionality. Like how people use it, what they're going to do with it, they have to decide. And it is a mechanism that is now there that opens possibilities. And if we do it and we use it and we model it, then you create the plausibility structure and the permission structure to think, oh, well, maybe it's not so crazy to do it and things like that. And Greg, thank you for being here. And I'll throw it to Mike. Yeah, like I've never met Michael or Christian or Sam in person, but my life is way better for knowing them than not. So the internet has opened up something. And then, of course, there's the possibility of meeting in person. So I certainly don't want to be saying that meeting in person is the justification of the internet. I guess I want to be saying is that there is some sort of interesting feedback loop that every individual in their own circumstance can explore and figure out that could open up value creations that we've never seen before for people, and who knows what it could do. In the same way that the pricing mechanism opens up feedback loops that create value that we've never seen before. And so you create that architecture, like you create that environment for possibility that I think it is central. I appreciate everything you were saying, Greg. But let me throw it to Michael here, then Christian and Sam. Michael, please.
Kind of on this point of like the fragmented lives that we live. I just finished this amazing book called Narcissus and Goldmund. It's written by Hermann Hesse. And yeah, the subtitle of it is A Raging Battle Between Flesh and Spirit. And yeah, it's great. But basically the kind of spark notes of the book is it concerns two characters, Narcissus and Goldmund. They're both living in a cloister, and Narcissus is devoted to the monastic life. He's an intellectual. He's, kind of just the prototypical like head on a stick, a little bit of he tries to use abstract reasoning and thinking to create his, spiritual reality, and he's kind of used his mind to kind of like take him out of his life and kind of disconnect himself from his senses and feelings and creative desires. And then Goldmund is this artist, kind of like he's a sculptor, he's I think a poet as well. He's also like a womanizer, and so he has like all these tensions with the ascetic life, and he leaves. And the end of the book is just like I was like tearing up reading it. Like it was so beautiful because they like come together, and Narcissus realizes what he's been missing out on with the life that Goldmund has led, and how he's kind of always look down on him. But actually there's so much beauty and richness that he has that, you know, he kind of missed out on. And Goldman also realizes that as well. And I just kind of wanted to read a little bit, and then, yeah, kind of just tie it into what we were talking about. But seen from above with God's eyes, was this exemplary life of order and discipline, of renunciation of the world and of the joys of the senses, of remoteness from dirt and blood, of withdrawal into philosophy and meditation any better than Goldman's life? Had man really been created to live a regulated life, with hours and duties indicated by prayer bells? Had man really been created to study Aristotle and St. Thomas, to know Greek, to extinguish his senses, to flee the world? Had God not created him with senses and instincts, with blood-colored darknesses, with the capacity for sin, lust, and despair? These were the questions around which the abbot's thoughts circled when they dwelt on his friend. And I just love that, because this, like, philosophy as a way of life, like, you know, the kind of goal of philosophy to kind of thrust us back into our common life and not take us away from it. It also made me think of, I was in a men's circle this morning, and one of the guys was talking about a conversation he had with a woman who owns a coffee shop, and she also is an illustrator. And he asked her, will you be able to live off of your art? And she says, I think that's the wrong question. I think the question that you should be asking is, are you able to live off of your creativity? And so, you know, for her, she probably sees her work in the coffee shop as just as creative as, you know, her work as an illustrator. And I just had this thought this morning, even before that circle, of like, I recently started working as a server at a winery. I pour wine, and I, you know, work in the back as well. And you know, that's not gonna be like my forever job. And, you know, some days I'll like go to work and it'll be really tiring. I'll, you know, see a lot of people, and I'll come home and I'll be quite tired, and, you know, I won't have the energy to like write a poem or like, you know, do some creative work. And I'll sometimes kind of feel like bad about that. Like my day wasn't like fulfilling, or I wasn't like doing my, like, you know, creative work or whatever. But I just realized recently, like, someone told me yesterday, I told them that I'm, you know, in school to be a therapist, and she was like, yeah, I feel like you'd be really good at that, because like the way that you look at me, like the way, like your eye contact, it just feels like very connective. And I was like, oh, like, yeah, I'm showing up every day as myself in this job. And like, I'm very grateful for that, because not every job gives you that opportunity. And I'm displaying a creative attunement and attention. And so I think the cultural moves that I see happening is people kind of abandoning the desire to like make money off of their art, so, like, you know, necessarily, and more in the business and the spirit of integrating their whole self into their existing systems, or creating new systems if there aren't ones that exist to allow for that, in work, at the home, in third spaces and community. And creativity looks differently in different spaces, and depending on who you're with, you know, like you don't have to be Daniel writing short stories to read to your kids at night to make you feel creative as a dad. Like, you plant the plants, you think about how to, you know, create your home beautifully, you engage in conversations with your kid, you know, whatever it might be. Like, it looks different than your than the creative work that you do as a writer and even as, you know, like a philosopher. And yeah, so I just kind of wanted to offer that into the space.
No, very well put. And yeah, there's something about creativity more than just a product or short story, as in thinking about the entire environment in which people enter when they come in, like making an entire environment, making an entire space that when people come in, they can apprehend or have something occur that otherwise could not, right? And that can be everything from the way you look at the person, the way you speak to them, if the garden has been done, if you've done all of these different things, that actually creates the possibility of something being experienced that otherwise could not. That I think is closer to life or feeling alive, and so on and so forth. I think also that book by Herman Hesse is my favorite by him. I also think a lot about the Glass Bead game on this question of education and the future of education and so on. And I don't, you know, it's a thought that I kind of get from that book, and I would have to think of it more. There is a sense of what is being suggested is that I think often we want to find a life course or a way of life in which if we do it, there won't be any mistakes. We won't miss out on anything. Okay, I'll be an academic and I'm good to go. Okay, I'll be like not academic. I'll just be out in the world and I'll be good to go. And I think what Mr. Hess is showing is it's not so simple, right? There are pluses and minuses for both, because obviously Goldsmith goes through that story, makes a lot of mistakes and suffers a lot. And that's one of the reasons he comes back, right? But then there's also an idea of, how much is missed out when you don't live that life full of mistakes, right? I think as a kind of overarching point, there's kind of an idea that there's like, it's not possible for there to be a moment in your life that might be in the wrong direction. Similarly, it's not possible to have a moment in your life that might not possibly be in the right direction, right? Like every moment has a contingency to it, right? And that I think is really important, because then you're aware, you're paying attention. And you could be paranoid, but actually there can be an artfulness to this, because I think one, it always means there's kind of redemption, but also creative possibility, or things will open up. I mean, when you realize that too, I think you can become more forgiving and graceful to other people. Because when you realize that every decision that everyone makes could actually, even if it seems like a good decision at the time, can be bad ultimately, or even things that are bad decisions they've made now could ultimately be good, then there's actually more space for the other, because everything can be turned, everything can be contingent, everything can be sublimated, right? So I think it makes more grace for yourself, and I think it can make more grace for others. And I think it also helps you actually appreciate all of the life choices that all people make, and why you want to make environments that actually help people follow through all of that difference, like a better ecosystem. Like we're saying, I think the social coordination mechanism with the pricing mechanism makes a better ecosystem of diverse possibilities. Because if every way of life that people do could possibly end up in a beautiful direction, in the same way it could end up in a terrible direction, then you won't assume that, man, that person has all the status, they have all the success, therefore they've got a great life. Well, maybe not. And then likewise, you won't assume the drunkard on the side of the street is poor off. Well, they actually may open things up that is not there. So I think what Hess shows is pointing to a certain contingency of all possibilities that if you take seriously, then you want to get, rather than finding the right life track or the right course of decisions, like I'll study philosophy and then I'll be set, you want more of a kind of art of moments, a kind of awareness of things. And then I guess the last thing, and I'll throw it to Christian and Sam, is in a way, the argument that I think the incompleteness of economics shows, there's always that idea of how will I make money off of art? The growth of the system is dependent on actually making art off of money, actually, like flipping it, to the degree that everyone's like in that kind of mindset of like, how will creativity generate money or something like that. It's a complete reverse. I think Samuel Barnes is pointing to that with attentionalism, where a lot of people now, instead of asking how will these attention gathering things make money, they're like, no, actually getting attention is more valuable than money. It's more kind of fundamental. We're kind of, I think, in this moment of realizing something more fundamental than money that we actually have to point to. Now, that has to be expanded on, but let me throw it to Christian here. Christian, please.
Well, I'm going to try to be limited in my responses to Greg since he's not here. I'm sure I'll have other opportunities to speak with him. But I thought it was important what he was saying in that I don't think we can take any given frame like an economic analysis and capture everything that needs to be captured about creativity And maybe a stronger thing to say would be that when we try to capture creativity at all, even in part, even knowingly in part, there's some risk in kind of distorting our presentation of what creativity is and why it's important, etc. But from the other angle, I would say something like we can't create, and I'm not sure if this is what he was trying to say, but I don't think we can create some very solid line between economics and creativity. And I mean, you can very quickly drum up an argument along the lines of creativity depends on leisure, depends on resources and energy and blah, blah, blah. Right. So, you what are we talking about if we're not talking about economics, right? You could say it touches upon everything. It's right. So, but then I thought, Michael's comments kind of helped bring all of this together a little bit, or asked us to conceive of a holistic framing where we look at everything through the lens of creativity, right? And maybe we can say that's going to be just as limited as trying to look at everything through the lens of economics, and yet. On balance, I think it's something that we're needing to do because we so rarely do that. We so rarely take a moment to look at how we can approach what otherwise might seem kind of mundane or uncreative through the lens of creativity, which is to say, through the lens of I want to say passion and love and experimentation and expressing oneself in a deep way, to express one's love for life, one's love for the other, in a way that meets each particular moment and all its particularity. That kind of demands a bit of creativity, right? There's Sure, there's like a rote monotony to serving coffee at the coffee house, and you kind of have these little whatever choreographed things that you just repeat over and over and over, and yet there's always something a little different. Each customer brings a slightly different energy that you can meet in a slightly different way in order to, again, express your appreciation for your shared humanity in that moment. And I think this is probably not other than what we would call living a spiritual life, in that it's, this is very deep, holistic kind of connection type of framework. How am I to explore my connection with the other and with life itself in each moment in a way that's maximally meaningful and whatever appeals to my deepest values. But I think it's where I want to kind of pull away from Greg most strongly is in how putting lines between creativity and economics can make it hard for us to consider how creativity it goes beyond the boundaries of whatever artwork, so to speak. Expressionist music and painting and poetry and all this kind of thing. We kind of quarantine creativity away, and then allow the rest of life to be a bit too rote. And if let's say we're dealing with a political problem, a policy problem, which we are all the time, right? If you care to pay attention to what's going on around you, there's a bajillion policy problems at different scales and within different power structures. And if we've kind of quarantined creativity away, we're from those arenas, we are left appealing to maybe something like economics or GDP or whatever our dogmas might be about the rule of law and what justice should mean. And we often forgetting that all of this has come from creativity, right? I mean, the ideas that we appeal to when we have a political conversation didn't come out of nowhere. They came out of many, many, many a strong lineage of conversations, and oftentimes involving philosophy, a love of wisdom and creativity and thinking new thoughts, right? Finding new ways to connect what we seem to be able to say about life itself and then how we should engage with each other. So I think it's, and I say this partly from someone who spent a lot of time in creative scenes. I mean, like spending time with, let's to coin a term, call them like arch hipsters, right? Like very, very people with tastes in artwork and fashion and blah blah blah, that's, you know, whatever, about as quote unquote cool as you can get. And I found these scenes to be very lacking and very kind of cloistered in their own way, where there's, you know, kind of inside that cloister of taste maybe, or something like this, and then there's the outside. And once you step outside, you've kind of left your creativity behind you, right? And I think that from my experience, that did not create like a very healthy or holistic social environment for people. You know, I love my art friends, and they will remain some of my favorite people and best friends of all time. And I can say from firsthand experience what it looks like when you kind of try to put creativity into this protected little stable, and it's not great. So, you know, I'm on the one hand wanting to say something along the lines of we shouldn't draw such deep boundaries between these different aspects of how we approach life, creatives, economics, policy, blah blah blah. On the other hand, you know, in approaching any other different framework, we have to always be mindful of the distortions that are created when we try to look through everything from a singular, oh, I'm going to put on my economic glasses. I have to remember that when I'm talking about creativity through my economic glasses, that I'm missing something. And when I'm talking about economics through my creativity glasses, I'm going to be missing something. So it's anyway, rambling a bit, but I think there's these two things, boundaries, keep them thinner, limitations be more cognizant of as we switch between, like, go through these different domains.
I think that's getting at a lot that's very important, Clayton. Mr. Jockin, good to see you. I've been speaking a bit on reviewing Mr. Stiglitz and Piketty and different people. So there's a bunch of things. Basically, there has to be something where economics and creativity are brought together while maintaining the distinction. And that's always the million-dollar tension. How do you bring things together without blurring them? I would say that's a Hegelian tension. That is, I would say, a lot of the tension of life. Like, how do you bring, like, a friendship has to bring difference together and honor difference. But if there's too much difference, then it's chaos and nothing makes sense, right? Like, you have to have intelligibility. And there has to be something where economics brings creativity together without conflating it with productivity, but also creativity is dangerous. I mean, that's also a lot of kind of the issue as well, is that creativity, as for me, being the incompletion, like that is the point of incompleteness in economic modeling. Well, you could argue there's a real good reason they kind of push creativity aside, is because it can make people go crazy. It's the real. It's like it can destroy social intelligibility. People don't know what to make sense of. And so there's this issue where this thing that, for me, this economics has relied on also has this kind of wild life to it, a kind of wilderness, as Mr. Satori may say. It's kind of the incompleteness of institutions, as Dr. Shah was saying, in things. But I would also argue that our ability to handle creativity in a manner that is sublimated versus self-destructive also is, I think, significantly higher if we have a social coordination mechanism. It goes up, the ability by which we can actually use it. There's also a bunch of other things, like there's also things as well where we have to be careful before we're talking as if the economy is completely a disaster, because that can go too much on the Stiglitz side or whatever. I mean, there are also things too where I think when we start, not on the Stiglitz side, but some of the conversation, maybe more Piketty or different things. I think one of the issues, if I would just make a claim, I think there is opportunity in the world, but people don't feel permission to care. They don't feel permission to try, or they don't feel permission to say move, right? And I think a lot of the social and again, I'm just kind of championing the social coordination mechanism, because I do think it is basically the social technology that has been needed to correspond with Hike's pricing mechanism by which you can actually get the fullness of capital in non-zero sumness that opens up a lot of potential, that actually honors the solar residual without bringing it into modeling that is problematic. But it is an art form. And it is kind of dangerous. And we have to work on it diligently because, like Sam has said, creativity can be bad. Creativity can lead to madness. Look at the history of all these things. So if we are now in an age where to some degree the socioeconomic system, in order to have rates of return on capital not be greater than growth, that we have to deal at a greater spread with creativity, then you're dealing with a kind of dangerous age, right? You're dealing with something dangerous. But if actually the education system was formed in that way, if social interactions were thinking that way, then actually you had a Manhattan Project in that direction, then that's kind of the work that needs to be done. And I think that then the idea of rates of return on capital over growth can actually be the forcing function to kind of move you in that direction. But we also have not had the technology by which to coordinate the work by which we may do that. I think also the last thing I'll say, there's a lot of, I mean, it's all very, very important. I think also if I think about creativity, I associate personally creativity with creating a way of life, which is much more an ecosystem, much more an environment. It is not merely the writing of books or short story, but the kind of world that affords, the kind of life that affords, the kinds of relationships you can have in doing that kind of thing, the kind of experience you can have in the world. I think when creativity becomes just about the product, I think it tends toward narcissism or other problems. But if indeed it's more of like, well, actually, writing the book makes you a kind of person that makes possible a way of life that couldn't be had other than, say, writing the book or painting, well, then you're moving to something larger. You're moving toward a bigger ecosystem, a bigger kind of art of living, as Ivan Illich said, right? Like you want to be the kind of when you speak with people, you want to be the kind of person who has written books or who cares about the arts, right? That way of talking with people or being with people is just, for me, more primary than the creativity of the product, but the product is part of the art of living. And I think when you see it that way, then it becomes okay to like write a story, even if nobody reads it or you don't sell it for money or whatever, because you gain a quality of life in who you are, how you experience your life, and the kind of environments and ecosystems and spaces that your presence can change in quality. You become a kind of person that you couldn't be otherwise. And I think that's the art of living. I think so much of that is tied to the art of living. But let me pause and throw it to Sam and then Mr. Satori. Sam, please.
Hey, I kind of had the feeling like we stopped talking about like creativity as such and started talking about like instances of creativity or experiences of creativity. And instead of talking about creativity as economic or something, we started talking about creativity and the economy, or, you know? And like, I kind of want to try and draw an image that might bring them back together, I guess. I hope. I attempt. Which is that, like, I don't know, I think when Greg was talking and when you were talking about the incompleteness of the economic, like there is a whole somewhere. There is a whole that encompasses both the economic and the creative, and there is a whole that encompasses friendships online and offline, you know, like there's, you know, like everything at some scale is one. And then I was thinking like, I was kind of thinking like when Greg was saying there's no problems to be solved, but I was like there's like 1,000 little paper cuts in the world, you know, like to be solved. And they contribute to things of productive, you know, of a productive nature. Like just like I was thinking like, you know, like if you lose your mother, like you have to go back to work at a certain point. You're really just not going to be efficient. And there's going to be this mingling of like what it means to die for you in your worldviews that is specific to you and what it means to your boss. And all these things are going to like kind of grind in the gears of the economic. And then I was thinking a bit about like, you know, like we talk a lot about the boomers, the insufferable boomers, but things really, I think they were just easier. Like I'm thinking about the process that they would have had to go through to get an apartment as, you know, say 30 years ago. It's like recently I tried to get an apartment where the landlord like called me and I was in the shower, and then he like, because I didn't pick up, he just called the next people. but like I was anticipating that he'd email us because we emailed him the thing. Like, and like there's so many things like that. Like to be an architect, I used to just have to like stand at a desk and then like talk to people occasionally, and my communication skills were talking, writing, notating drawings. But now I have to learn to use Slack. I have to learn to use team meetings. Everything just has more channels. It's more complex to be living in society. And it goes back to the 1,000 little paper cuts. Like people get tired. People don't feel like they have spaciousness to do the things that they want to do in the evenings, as Michael was saying. Like feels a little incomplete, but you've got to do the day job kind of thing. And I think the kind of whole point where all of these things tie together is that the world is like this Gordian knot that is like a maypole, like a giant maypole, and everything's always going forward in time, and like and complexifying. There's this Jure quality where everything is just more and more and more. Like cities are just like these knots that get tied up into tighter and tighter bundles. And time moves forward in this sort of like way that causes these cavitations where suddenly one week you just don't feel like yourself or something. Like it's like, what is this weird air bubble of time?
Oh, Sam, come back. Okay, well, I really like
The
what
air
you were
bubble
saying.
popped.
The air bubble freaking popped. What I was gonna say is I really like that 1,000 paper cup things he was saying, because I think it's a really big deal. I'll talk for a second and then throw it back to her and throw it to Michael. That idea that there are people that have thousands of little paper cuts that impact their productivity. This is extremely important because for me, there's two ways you approach that. Okay, you either say, let's remove people who have paper cuts, and that is productivity that moves you closer. So let me read this section out of the book, because there's two. This is the problem. They're conflating two freaking productivities and creativities. Okay, so far, this is starting on page 38. So far, we have presented convincing evidence that economies and firms operate well below the production possibilities frontier. What they could have produced, given the current state of knowledge, the best practice that are available within the economy. And that, here's the key, that much of the growth in productivity can be related to moving toward the frontier. Okay, so you have a business that is here. This is how productive it could be. They measure growth as getting closer to that frontier, right? But that's called more endogenous growth, okay? It's within growth. You're becoming more efficient within yourself, right? A stupid amount of growth is in that kind of growth, right? The argument I would like to make is that the growth that actually increases non-zero sumness, that makes growth more than returns on capital, is where the frontier moves. Like you move the frontier, not just closer to the frontier, or you make a new frontier. But there is not a healthy distinction in economics between moving closer to you being more productive in your possibilities versus creating new possibilities, if that makes sense. This is extremely important. And the reason why this is so important, I'll talk to Mr. Satori here unless Sam comes back. So you know how you get rid of all those 1,000 paper? So you're basically saying, okay, there's 1,000 paper cuts that are keeping us from reaching our productivity possibility. So replace them with robots. Then they don't have freaking paper cuts. Now we hit our productivity frontier. This is the problem. If you have a model where productivity equals growth and there's no distinctions with creativity, the name of the game is to get rid of the paper cuts versus learning to live with them, learning to handle them, and actually seeing those paper cuts as potential material for creativity. Are not artists people that take lacks and cuts and do something beautiful with it? We've talked very often with Mr. Junkin on how beauty and making new frontiers, new forms actually require the paper cuts. But you're only going to think that you actually need those paper cuts and to take them on if you believe that there's a distinction between productivity as in endogenous growth, approaching the productive frontier, and exogenous growth, which is a new frontier. Okay? But so if you don't do exogenous growth, then growth narrows and is not public, and you get all sorts of pathologies in the system. Okay, but exogenous requires people to be able to handle facing one another's paper cuts, having the skills by which to do it. Well, where did you learn that? You didn't. So I guess we'll go back to the endogenous growth model and then have returns on capital greater than growth, and we all get the Nicklandian thing, right? So the social coordination mechanism becomes necessary to handle those little cuts and to handle them all. But the problem, kind of looking to like what Greg was saying, is that if you try to deal with the little cuts by making them quantifiable, by dealing with them through prescriptions and plans versus things you're prepared for and surprise find, you give pills to everything as opposed to learning to live with wounds. You try to solve everyone's problems versus dwell in them, and this creates a very different quality of the system that ironically destroys the very growth that it was supposedly doing all of these things to incubate. So I think, like, it does in a certain sense come down to, do we actually believe that all of those little cuts make our lives better or not? Do we actually believe that there's something about cuts and difficulties that give something to life that otherwise would not be there? If we do not believe that, if we do not believe ultimately what that means, that lack is not nothing, the absolute choice, the final absolute choice, if we don't believe that, then what becomes rational is to believe lack is nothing. Those cuts are not necessary. There's no quality of life those cuts give us that we couldn't get otherwise. Well, then you're going to have a growth model that is the removing of those cuts via productivity that is getting rid of creativity. Thus, it's going to be more robotic. Now, I believe that if we have social, as Mr. Satori has been working on, I personally believe that if we have social coordination with the pricing mechanism, that AI can unlock social coordination possibilities that were never before possible, and that AI can be a wonderful thing, but it needs the social coordination mechanism to accompany it so that the growth in AI is not merely androgynous, approaching the full possibility frontier, but is actually opening up new forms in productivity. And I think that's what we, to use it for conviviality, as Illich might say, versus manipulation. But let me stop and then throw it to Mr. Satori. Mr. Satori, thank you for coming on this fine day, sir.
Wonderful to be here. Well, let's see, man, there were so many things where the whole conversation was going. And I think, one of the things I did try to kind of get at with my writing projects to learn things, wrote that big book and went into all those different aspects, economics and other things like architecture and stories and, all these different categories of thought, like, that are all important things. And that we have these divisions because of some crisis in the past. Something caused us to, have to make a distinction and have to work these things out. But they're all basically aiming towards some same thing. Which, well, I guess my conclusion with the whole economic thing is, like, what are you going to invest in? And ultimately, the best thing to invest in is people. If you see the person as, like, the thing that you are producing, everything else is a byproduct of that. And that's even the thing where it's like we see people who achieve great things and become great people because of their pursuit of that thing. But the real, it's the we view it as, like, the thing that they're making is the product, and the character they develop is the byproduct, which you can't remove one from the other. So we need things. We need to be building things. We need friction. We need a reason to survive and to get together. And actually, as I was thinking about this, so, like, what does it mean to be like human, to be made in the image of God? And one of these interesting things I've thought about is these two very different things. So one is the fact that humans are very dependent. They're the most dependent creatures. There's no more helpless creature on Earth than like a newborn baby. It cannot do anything. Like, it needs an insane amount of somebody else caring about it for it to survive. Like if you look at a chimp or something, within a couple days, the chimp can, like, hang on to its mother's fur. But a human baby can't do that for, like, months, and so it's like, well, all of us are here because somebody really, really cared about us a lot. But the other thing is that we have this, like, hubristic sense of our own importance. And actually was thinking about this. In Philippians it says that Christ, what's unique about Christ in his humanity is that he did not consider equality with God something to be grasped. And if that's what's unique about him, that means that all of us, at some level, we do view equality with God as something to be grasped. And that's the thing of, like, Adam grasping the fruit. That's what he's doing. And essentially, you know, as I've been thinking about this, I'm like, okay, God doesn't ever really try to change that aspect of us, of you know, within us. He's basically saying, okay, you've made that decision, we're going to go with it, we're going to work around it. And so then we're stuck in this thing of like thinking that we have the ability to like become gods, and yet also being hopelessly dependent and unable to help ourselves. And out of that like dichotomy, we're always struggling and you know, bumping into each other. And I think one of the main problems that we get into is that at a certain point, whenever we tend to get enough agency to have some impact in the world, we decide that the best way for ourselves to move closer to being like God is to stop other people from pursuing that same thing. And I mean, and I think that's the thing where we get into all these problems, because we keep coming into all these like constraints of society and culture, and you know, and you know, some of it is like, you know, it's like you say, like America is like a free country. Like you can do whatever you want, you can start a business, you can do all these things, but it's like, yeah, but nobody's showing you how the heck to do that. Most people don't feel they have permission to do that. We're not really encouraging people to do that. And it's like the people that do know that are more or less keeping a lot of that stuff secret, or they're colluding or whatever, you know. So, and you could just see like the way like local government like zones real estate is like such a thing of this. It's like you have all these people, boomers, whatever, you know. But anyways, the people that are saying like, we want to keep our town zoned for only single family homes and no industry, because we wanted to maintain a small town feel. And like I just heard of a guy who was trying to buy a old like bottling plant or something, and he wanted to turn it into like a chicken farm and a processing plant and like a small business and a place for small businesses. And the town was like, well, we like the small business part, but we don't like that other stuff because we want to maintain the small town feel. So instead, they just will continue to have this abandoned, derelict building that's not doing anything because they don't want to let somebody do something creative with it. And you know, eventually, if you have enough of that, then you just get people fed up. You know, you get the barbarians coming into the city, or they emerge from inside and force their way out, or whatever. You know, so yeah, it's just balancing that thing of like, what do we do about this thing where we rebel against any claims on our inability to do something. You know, there's like nothing that motivates us more than somebody telling us you can't do that, or you shouldn't do that, or whatever. And yet we also cannot do things on our own. So we do need help, and we need other people. And it's figuring out the balance of that. I guess that is the best place to put creativity. If you put the creativity into solving that problem, you unlock the potential for everything else.
I think that got at a lot right there, Mr. Satori, and I appreciate it. And if anyone has any final things to say this fine evening before I go and unfold chairs and all of those fun things. We have 2 weddings this weekend, and I'm glad to say that I don't think it's going to be raining or boiling hot, so that's quite good. But well, I really like what you're saying about this idea of this kind of tension between ultimate dependency and being like God. And there's something very odd about that, right? And there's also something like, if we think beauty or surprise, there's something about like your moments of encountering God or godlikeness have to be outside of your control. And they have to be something that kind of happen, like that is a matter of preparation and surprise and kind of encounter. Like it cannot ever be something you have control over. And I do think basically the argument I would like to make is that the economy is only able to actually grow in a non-zero sum way to the degree that it is able to handle what it cannot control. And it makes space for what it cannot control. And that to the degree that it's trying to control everything, that it's plan-based versus prepare-based, then growth actually it shrinks. Rates of return on capital overcome growth, and then you get social tensions and all of these various problems, right? And in that way, you could say the economic system as a whole has a zoning law problem. Like it creates sort of these zones of operation to make everything that's real, that which it can quantify. Therefore, it is like God, but it has no dependency. As opposed to, there's a weird way, I suppose, where the like Godness comes out in the encounter of dependency. Right? Like when you realize, oh, you're dependent on God. Well, now you're like God because you kind of recognize that you need God. There's a certain likeness that emerges in dependency. Likewise, wealth can come out as wealth when it realizes its dependency on that which it does not control. And therefore, it should honor people using their time in a manner that seems like it's not very productive, like writing short stories that you don't, that you do for their own sake, right? Well, that's not very productive. Are you doing that because you're going to be a writer? No, because if the system does not entail people doing this sort of thing, wealth actually reverses and becomes stagnation, is the term that Keynes and Cohn of different people. Stagnate, a way to look at economic stagnation, because that's ultimately what I'm arguing for. Without creativity, that's what happens. Stagnation is when GDP goes up, but not living standards. That's the easiest way to put it. You know, that like, let's say Wall Street goes up, but not Main Street. So if Wall Street was going down and Main Street, that wouldn't be stagnation. That would just be bad. That would just be depression or something, right? So, you know, stagnation is where GDP, it no longer correlates with living standards. Like, you know, living standards could actually be going down as GDP is going up. And the argument I would like to make is that to the degree the economy fails to observe its need for that which is outside of it, lack that is not nothing, creativity is actually to the degree that the system heads towards stagnation. And then, of course, under stagnation, you get social revolution, political extremism, people get pissed off, violence erupt. Stuff that's happening now because the system does not actually honor the outward space. But then the problem is, how do you, this is ultimately the $1 million, like a lot of the problem. How do you quantify, how do you coordinate and enable well that which cannot be quantified? Like, how do you do that? Like, don't you need to like quantify and plan in order to coordinate? Well, for most of history, yes. But now you have a social coordination mechanism where you can just encounter people and not have a plan. Like you have this ability of encounter without a set intention. You're able to create environments. And that allows the creativity to actually be coordinated, if you will, without it being squashed. So you can actually, without it being quantifiable and limited, because that's the problem. Like we've never in history been able to coordinate that which is fundamentally qualitative without ruining the quality or changing it into a different quality, right? And that's where you get in trouble, because if you change the quality, then it could ultimately be serving stagnation as opposed to non-zero sumness. Well, social coordination as a mechanism would be a way to coordinate more so in terms of quality, but you have to have people that feel permission and a willingness to do that which they cannot quantify, that which they cannot justify in terms of productivity or economics. Like being here on a Thursday, why are you doing it? Because if people socially do not have the social imagination to value things because, then you're not, then people won't take advantage of that coordination. But then it's important then that the people that are showing it and creating the plausibility structure and the permission for people to do those things, which then allows effective coordination of that which is fundamentally qualitative, that the system without heads towards stagnation. And it heads towards zero sumness versus non-zero sumness, or it gets eclipsed by the effectiveness of the pricing mechanism, ergo productivity in a quantifiable sense, at the expense of creativity. And therefore, the system loses the art of living. I just dropped the book on the floor and lost the page that I was going to read. But I'll throw it to Christian here. But I think also what you were saying, yeah, I guess I also want to say on like the zoning law stuff, like you were just saying, we want to keep the small town feel. You can't keep anything you deny encounter. You want your small town to feel like a small town, but you deny it encounter with the modern world, it will become pathological, repressive, and your small town won't feel like a small town anymore, actually. It will feel like a politically extreme place or kind of closed-mindedness or things like that. You don't get to keep anything you deny encounter. And you see, if you don't allow yourself to encounter, say, the new business or the AI or the different things, then that act of denial, as opposed to encountering and you're prepared for it and you can handle it, that changes the qualitative whole of the thing that you're defending. It now moves into repressive. It's now fear-based. It's now fragile. It doesn't develop anti-fragility. And actually, it will then move away from having, in the name of saving the small town feel, you actually begin to lose it. because you can't ever return to you can't go back to the small town before it denied the encounter, after it does deny the encounter. And then, of course, because now people know you kicked out that business. Now people know you did, and they don't have jobs, and they don't have those opportunities, and the money dries up because the investment doesn't come in, and then it kind of dwindles away. So you don't get to keep the small town unless you can handle encountering the large town, but then you have to have the kinds of people that can handle that. Like, you don't get to keep what you can, what you deny encounter. More needs to be said on that. But let me throw it to Christian here. Christian, please.
Yeah, my small rural area, it's not necessarily small, but it is very rural, is currently going through the painful process of dealing with data centers showing up like much of the nation is. And just as an anecdote, maybe a little bit of why the internet is important, because we've already encountered the non-local. Where does your food come from? Where does your cell phone service come from, right? And now the cost of these things is showing up in our backyard. But I try not to engage. I typically don't. I just write my newsletter when I have things to say about this. But I watch the Facebook fights, and someone was like, "Well, we use the internet, so we need data centers." And someone responded, "I've been using the internet for 30 years without data centers, and it's been fine. So we don't need these new data centers." And that's, I now have the job to like educate my community about like, hey, if you really hate data centers, maybe we shouldn't be like scrolling TikTok videos while streaming 4K videos, because that's like 51% of our data demand is not AI, it's streaming video. Anyway, yeah, I could go on and on about that, but I thought in the spirit of non-productive art, I would share a poem I wrote. My friend recently hosted a group poetry sharing, where over the course of like 4 months, everyone shared. He put together little collections of everyone's anonymous poetry and then shared that back out. So it was fun. I don't even know who the other 12 people in my poetry group are, except that they all know my friend Jaime. But anyways, I thought I would share one of the poems I wrote. And I should say, I just made the decision at the beginning to write very weird, irreverent, goofy poems in this context. But I liked this one more than the others. Stop all the downloads. Hide your dog's ashes. Enter Mr. Sandman. A growing party of nuns, threshing, tipping, leasing, blue smoke in thin slices. I live inside a mechanical battery. My webbed hands feel fresh. My roommate knows a goose. That's all I've got today, folks. Thanks, Daniel.
My neighbor knows a goose. I'm going to share that with my kids. Thank you, Christian. I appreciate that very much. And actually, it's very interesting to think about data centers with this topic. Because, like you say, there's a way in which you're already using the internet, right? And you say, well, we're a small town and we don't, but you've already kind of participated in it, right? You're already kind of using it. And again, for me, that's where, like, there's something about the small town. The problem can be where people use small town to kind of mean simple. Like, we don't think about these things. We don't have that bigger picture. We're just a simple folk. And a lot of my movement from like David Hume with Common Life to taking on the German idealism is seeing that sets people up. They're not ready. They're not ready because things show up. They don't have self-defense. They haven't thought of these things. They get manipulated, and they don't already see how they are kind of in two worlds already, the small world and the global. And then it is here. And they don't actually know how to approach it because they've been using the streaming video perhaps predominantly for entertainment, as opposed to, say, getting aware of these things or educated in these things. Because if you simply get to the place where you say, I don't like it or it's bad, well, what's the policy? Like, what are the details of these different things? So it's very interesting you bring that up. Yeah, and I guess I was also and then I'll throw it to Mr. Jockeneer, and if anyone else wants to speak on this fine day, just raise your hand. I guess also another thing that I think about for doing this kind of work is, like, in life, you don't know what you don't know. And it's really important to just have a chance of encountering what you don't know. And the more people that are putting things online or conversations or talking about the things go on, or even what you're saying on the data center, that adds, however small a bit, it increases the probability that someone who doesn't know, they don't know something that matters, comes upon that, and their life will now be different. You're just kind of throwing those seeds. And I really do, I do think people's lives are so strongly defined by what they don't know they don't know. Not what they know, not what they don't know, that they don't know, but what they don't know they don't know. And the more you can be throwing seeds out there to help people be prepared for that, to be aware of that, I think goes a long way to actually, well, making the system, quote unquote, more growth, more productive, more creativity, more efficient, but in the name of the human, being human, not just for the productivity of the firm. So just any seeds that can be thrown out there, I think matter. But let me stop and throw it to Mr. Jockin. Mr. Jockin, I hope you are well today, sir.
Two notes. One is, I think actually what Christian said about that statistic, I find that really interesting about the streaming. Because it's interesting the contrast of the narrative, the political narrative of the data center and the political discourse around that versus that statistical object of actual usage. Like, for example, the data centers have been presented as this anticipatory gathering of a resource of compute power so that we can address the AI gold rush, hypothetical AI gold rush. When I hear from Christian, what he's pointing out is that actually most of our demand and need has been our streaming services. That's a very different context now, isn't it? Completely changes the orientation about what these data centers are and what they're about. I'm just saying, in terms of, I think that's very interesting. I say this in the sense of, I think absolutely the idea of the political or the image making is 100% the case. The political imagination is what images we're presenting, right? And using statistical data like that, at least for me, had a very interesting revelation in terms of it's right here, right now, reorientation of the normed discourse account of data centers versus a hypothetical image of what another way we can look at it. I'll give you another example. So like I'm working with my Department of Visual Art and Performance Arts, and specifically the performance music and theater here at my university. And I had a workshop session with them to come to seek to understand what is their tensions, what are their limits, what are they struggling with, and they're very much in the discipline of design. How might we, based on constraints and limits, these are the materials you work with. If you came up with an abstract answer, that's the perfect solution visually, right? But doesn't respond to constraints and limitations. It doesn't that content materiality of constraint. So I'm bringing this up because one of my professors of music and theater and worked social promotion. The summary note was, yeah, we'll just keep constant more and more.
Dead zones. I don't like it, them.
Okay, I'm just gonna yield. I'm stuck in traffic and I'm in a dead zone. I'm gonna stop. That's all for now.
Well, it's like metaphorically a dead zone and actually a dead zone if you're stuck in traffic. So that's like, it's full body. It's all in. So I'm sorry about that, Mr. Jockett, but I like what you were saying on the hypothetical. And Cleo, I appreciate you fighting the internet despite Zoom and all of its madness. Yeah, I mean, what you're saying on limit, I mean, well, again, seeing things, like when you have that idea of let me see the data centers differently as reflecting streaming, there's a kind of aesthetic, a kind of image, right? Like that you see that. What many of the sociologists, Bourdieu and all these different people talk about is that our rationality follows our images. Like what we believe is rational is relative to aesthetics we've been exposed to, which it's very interesting to think that a mental image is a kind of aesthetic, a way of seeing things. Oh, that changes how I see that. Well, it's not like you literally see something different. You change how you see that, and that reorganizes potentially logic or rationality or so on and so forth. So what the sociologists kind of point out is that we come to associate being successful with a white collar job and being in a skyscraper. And that's the aesthetic that organizes our logic of what it means to be successful. So there's an aesthetic, there's a kind of image that organizes what we think is the logical and good use of our time. Well, if that's the case, it's really important to then do social coordination mechanism, creating images, modeling things, showing people to show an alternative, because that changes what is logical for people to do and what they believe is rational to do. Like, you're showing the image. That's why the social coordination mechanism being image-based for me and having this recording function is also quite different from a telephone. Also, of course, the ease of distribution, recording, etc. All of these things matter because you are seeing things. That is a new possibility that then changes how you can think about the thing. It's very difficult, perhaps impossible, to change how you think about something without seeing it differently. Almost by definition, seeing it differently is the act of thinking about it differently. So if you can't see something differently, you can't think about it differently, and that those actually kind of correspond, which then, of course, for me is a revelation that the true is not the rational. Like, what you see, like, oh, that's true. Oh, that's a new truth. And then that reorganizes the rationale. The other thing I would just say is that, yeah, what you're saying about constraint and limit, it makes me think of Mr. Satori's point, then I'll give it to Christian. Mr. Satori, is that, do you believe that limitation makes us more human in a certain sense, or do you believe we'll be more human if we remove limitation? And there's an interesting way, if the human is split between like godness and dependency, we are dependent on limits to be like God. In this sense, we need constraints, we need limitation to be like God. You could say, in a sense, in a theological sense, if you were like God without limit, there'd be two gods, and that would be a contradiction. Everything would blow up or something like that. So limitation is precisely the possibility of godlikeness, which means godlikeness is tied to dependency. The problem is economic theory basically thinks productivity equals removing limitation. The more you remove limit, the more growth you have. Which, on a certain sense, you say, well, surely that's the case. Well, the problem is removing limit as growth leads to non-efficient equilibriums. That leads to R being greater than growth. What you want is growth to be based on handling. You want growth to be in limit because of limit, thanks to limitation and constraints. And that means you have to have a people that choose limit, choose the paper cuts that Sam was talking about, as opposed to trying to remove the paper cuts, remove the limits. And that will actually give us growth. I think much of our moment is a question of, do we make the absolute choice for growth to be in limit or growth from limit? And I think the incompletion of the models in the ways we were describing point to that. But Mr. Jock, and actually, you think you're out of your dead zone, sir?
Let's find out. Sound test. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yay. Okay. I want to close. I'm going to try for it. Hopefully I don't lose connection. One last thing about this is that this object is present. Like, so I made this note about I'm working with the VPA, the theater department, and they're making a comment of, like, they're constantly doing more productions and they're constantly trying to communicate, but they feel like this, and they're struggling. They feel like the students aren't and faculty aren't coming. They're not coming to the events. So I got their particular accounts from the professors and the admins and the chair. And then I looked at some statistical analysis in terms of from Natural Endowment of the Arts. And they did some survey work on particular audience and Gen Z. Those are mostly the student people in our population who are students, especially. Here's a very interesting point, is a good example of, like, I find it's interesting sometimes when statistics can reorient your orientation of a problem. So I was expecting cost, time, location as a typical reason why people wouldn't come to art event, like performances and art, would want to. That's right. And for millennials and baby boomers and all the normal and those demographic populations, according to the Natural Endowment of the Arts, that is the case. Those are the major limitations. But check this out. For Gen Z, their number one limitation, what was their hindrance? What was stopping them from going to performances, art events in person they wanted to go to? This is by 44%, a massive larger standing. They didn't have anyone to go to the event with. That changed everything. I was like, oh my God, that changes everything. That's a good example of the thing that people don't know that actually determines everything. For me, it was just my entire strategy and orientation creatively to respond. Oh, and then you thought through what would be an elegant solution to address this problem. And I'm finding case studies that analogically reason this point to justify, well, different context, different situation, but this seems reasonably analogous to this current situation. Here's a possible solution. Basically, the night of the performance, you have an ambassador, basically one of the student workers or someone, a major in the department. They throw on a Mount St. Mary t-shirt. They say, hey, I'm going to be at the courtyard of the dorms half an hour before the event, and people come, and then invites people to come congregate at that center point in the courtroom, and then they walk together the performance. So now you just created a social context to allow people to socially coordinate and meet each other through a third joint attention object of synchronized time. So as an example, I would never have even proposed that thought had I not done that statistical analysis. I find that very interesting, just to share that note. A new orientation completely changed my response creatively to the limitation constraints. So instead of doing more, let's go one action that can get us a better result. Not more posts, not more geotagging, like not all this crazy interventions. Perhaps a more elegant solution, something as simple as that. I just want to share that note, and I'm down for that.
Magnificent. That's absolutely magnificent. And that is an example of one, social coordination, and there's an elegance to it. And for me, basically, if you're going to deal with the new address, you kind of have to get one move on the board, and that move, or else it's going to be compound and not elegant, and the likelihood of its success will be low. It would probably fall into entropy and disorder because of the multiplicity of possibilities. The one move on the board has to be something like the social coordination mechanism that changes the environment, because there's a social ambassadorship that is occurring there. And that's an example of social coordination. And I would go to the play with all you people. I would go with you. See, like social coordination helps us meet and we know who we're going to the play with. That's fantastic. I think, and that's just a brilliant example, like of learning something that changes how you see it, that opens up a possibility of address. One of the reasons I want to do lifelong learning is because I don't know what I'm not seeing rightly. Like, I don't know what could be seen differently. You don't know, like, you can't know what you could see differently. So you have to keep learning. You have to keep encountering. You have to keep meeting. You have to have in the model of your life a certain incompleteness. That is the thing that keeps you open to the possibility of seeing it differently. And that is analogous to the socioeconomic system as the whole. It has to have an openness of the incompleteness of creativity that keeps it always possibly seeing things differently, that if it doesn't do, it can't find more elegant solutions. And elegant solutions is a very great way to think of what creativity does in terms of socioeconomics. It finds something more elegant that then makes the productivity of the system more elegant. And in making it so more elegant, it actually brings together GDP and living standards. These things don't get separated in terms of stagnation. You get non-zero substance. So as the human being, and I'll throw to Christian and Sotura here, as a human being, I personally want to live in I constantly am like, I don't know what I don't know. And I don't know what I could see differently. That's an incompleteness that then chooses to make you invest yourself in learning, ever learning, which Stiglitz has told us a learning society is ground zero for growth. But my issue is I think the way they're defining learning is overly quantifiable in R&D. It's not based on the incompleteness of creativity. So I think that's a problem. But I can entirely agree with basically the explanation that they're giving, the thrust of the argument. It's just the address that I think is problematic because it needs a social coordination mechanism. They're going to emphasize government policy and intervention to create a learning society. I am going to emphasize the social coordinating mechanism for a learning society that can be assisted by policy, that could be assisted by government activity, but it must be more indirect, not direct. Now that gets into what I call word spread. Word spread is the specific policy and infrastructural changes to make people receptive to the social coordination mechanism, of which the government would possibly be able to help with, but it's quite different than the, say, interventions that Stiglitz is putting forth. He basically is going to make an argument for infant economy protectionism, where you create a tariff system so that economies are forced to learn. They're forced to learn how to learn because they don't have access to global markets. So he sees protectionism as critical to creating a learning society. And I think you get evidence that that can work with DeepSeek and so on and so forth. But I do believe that has unintentional consequences. And furthermore, someone like Piketty is going to put forth an international tax system that there's no, in my opinion, no possibility of getting the international consensus by which to have a global tax system that would help R not be larger than growth. I don't think any of those things are going to work, but nevertheless, what they're talking about has legitimacy to it. So you need a different address that is in terms of the social and culture, not state. And that's actually another reason why the conflation of state and social has been so problematic, as Murray Rothbard has pointed out, as I've spoken with Sartori about, and that gets into the classical liberal debate between Kirk, Hayek, and Rothbard, which I think is ground zero. But the point is that basically, as you as an individual need to always be learning in terms of an incompleteness because you don't know what you could see differently. And here's the thing, like solving basically that example you just gave, Mr. Jockin, you could theoretically try to solve it forever and never get anywhere because you don't see it correctly. You could be doing all this energy. You could be incredibly productive. You could hire people. You could have research committees. You could do all this work. But all of that productivity is not actually going to increase living standards because you're not seeing the problem properly. So all of your efforts of productivity are actually going to be well wasted. And you see, that's the problem of when you separate GDP from living standards, because GDP goes up just because you freaking spend. Like GDP, I'm screaming now. The problem with GDP is it basically perfectly reflects just liquidity. That's the major problem. Like GDP goes up if the liquidity flow is good, if money is being spent. Okay, so GDP will go up if you spend a whole lot of money. And I do think basically the health of the economy is a pure reflection of currency flow, just the movement of money. The movement of money equals GDP. Now, all of us can ask a simple question. What is that money moving toward? The models don't care. The models don't care. I think it really matters because if all the money is moving towards solving the problem Mr. Jockin put forth, but they see it as getting kids off of their phone or something, or location or whatever, you'll have a whole lot of freaking GDP, quote unquote. You'll have a whole lot of productivity, but you won't increase the living standard because you won't get people to actually go to the play. That problem that I just described that could theoretically happen with the example Jockin gave, I am arguing is happening to the entire global system. It's basically that because GDP has been separated from living standards and all it reflects is the money flow, which is the capital return, which is the movement of money. But that doesn't necessarily reflect increasing living standards. You hired people, you made an industry, but you didn't get kids to go to plays. Well, we tried. We had good intentions, we tried, and the GDP went up, so who cares? Who cares if we failed? The GDP could. Literally, we have a system that doesn't care as long as the GDP goes up, which almost here's the crazy thing. By definition, it does. This is where it's a real problem. Like, when GDP is separated from living standards, you know how you make GDP go up forever? Government debt. Debt, 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 debt. Spending. GDP will go up forever if you spend. And theoretically, if you never have a sovereign debt crisis, because it will destroy the world because it's too big to... We basically made debt too big to fail. That's what we're betting. If debt is too big to fail, then we'll spend forever and GDP will go up forever. We're good. We're freaking good. And that's true. If you look at the literature, if you could theoretically increase debt forever, GDP goes up forever. It's extraordinary because debt is the creation of money. That's what you have to understand on the global. When you get to the government, debt equals money. Like debt is money. That's the weird thing. Like the creation of debt is the creation of money. If the creation of money increases GDP, then the increase of debt is the increase of the GDP. Now, you may argue, wait a minute, if the GDP is going up because debt is increasing, does that increase living standards? I'll let you guess. But who cares? GDP is going up and it's your fault for not having a 401k. If you're not benefiting from that, it's your fault for not having stocks. It's your fault for not having capital or property that would be gaining in value as inflation sets up. And of course, that creates what? Age differentiation, because by definition, always older people tend to have the assets over the young. So they get the return on capital at the expense. And then the only way to fix this following the Great Leveling is World War, famine, sovereign debt crisis, or something like that. Or we could introduce a social coordination mechanism that would actually allow an incompleteness that makes the system able to create, not just based on productivity, that every freaking day of the year gets absorbed into the creation of debt. So it's a great example. I'm going to stop and throw it to Christian, and then I'll give it to Mike. Christian, please.
Wow, you got on a tear there, Daniel. It was a good tear. As while I'm writing about data centers for months now, or I should say researching and writing. I haven't published anything yet. I'll be doing that either tonight or tomorrow finally. But I did a deep dive into the kind of technocratic themes that are emerging, and I'll just say I don't know if we're as far as we might imagine from something like at least a semi-global tax structure. If we see network states get implemented, it's maybe it's unavoidable. I'm not sure because there's the more I look into it, the more it seems like not that a technocratic future is going to just be so delicious and attractive to people, but because it's going to be the only thing that offers a promise to solve the problems we all agree on in terms of corruption and bureaucracy, etc., which doesn't require us to confront lack and did you create the social coordination mechanism, etc. It allows us to continue kind of just to be passive consumers of whatever narrative, let's say, and then we'll find out where that road actually leads. But anyway, there's that. There was I thought Thomas's example was such a good example of where bringing creativity into policy is important, and also just saying like creativity is that willingness to break with what the assumptions of yourself or those around you are, right? To think in new directions, to ask new questions. This is not all of creativity, but it's certainly a part of it, right? It's a necessary part of it until you get to Thomas proposing an idea like, we'll do this and that will help coordinate people, blah blah blah. I was thinking, if I knew that and I was in charge of something, I would be like, I just offer a nominal discount when you buy 2 tickets instead of 1, because that gives people an excuse to invite people to events, right? You'd be like, oh, hey, there's a discount if we buy 2 tickets. Do you want to go? Blah blah blah, right? There's all sorts of funny little solutions you might come up with to try to solve that problem, which is a fun. I find it like a fun kind of problem to try to solve for. I was going back a little bit. I was thinking, touching on this theme of the boundaries we draw between, for instance, economics and creativity, and then this idea of like the small town or the rural area. There's a narrative that's been related to me many times about how the agricultural community is like just losing its progeny to migration to urban centers. There's people are just uninterested in carrying forward the family business of growing food. And so we see increased mechanization and then blah, blah, blah. There might be a little bit of a reversal of that after COVID, although I don't know if it's because people are all of a sudden like interested in going back to the farms per se, as there's things driving them out of cities. But anyway, I was asking myself the question, like, why do the younger generation not want to stay around, blah, blah, blah. And bringing back this theme of creativity, I think I think Daniel, you might be able to speak in interesting ways to this more than I can, just because you think about economics more than I do and economic narratives. But I'm thinking about like where you was it you, or I think it was you that gave the example, Daniel, of like the image of success, right? Being in a skyscraper, you're trading stock, whatever you're doing, fancy suit. But there's also the image of what it means to like engage with creativity, whether that's through expression or perception of it. And isn't it probably the case that as something like growing food gets further captured by the necessities of efficiency, etc., that there's less room for creativity in those environments, and then there's less attraction, right? Or people are just left looking for creativity and the meaning that you get from creativity elsewhere, outside of the farm, right? The farm is just it's a bottom line, and it's a very, very, very repetitive thing. The only thing that's not repetitive is tragic events like droughts, right? I mean, that's the only thing that's interesting, or if you can call it that, is like the horrible shit that's extremely stressful and can break your back. So yeah, it's anyway. So then I'm asking questions like, well, how might we find more of the creative in the local, in the kind of immediate supply chain framework? And well, I mean, I think it's something that people are already thinking about in little ways, but it got me thinking, like, how can the internet play a role in this? And I think it can. I think it can, in the sense that it can help to just create a stage upon which that reality can take place, and thus invite creativity, right? I'm thinking this might not be the right direction to think in, but I'm like basically thinking about like reality television, or I guess today you could say something more like content creation, right? A content creator or an influencer, etc. But once you put a camera on the family farm, not that that all of a sudden makes farming interesting, but it invites the creative drive, the creative impulse. And that obviously that can be kind of captured by whatever commercial interests and all sorts of things, but maybe it's like necessary that we find a way to invite creativity into something like food production. And that got me thinking about something I can't believe I haven't already shared on the net, which is a crazy idea I had while I think I had smoked both 5-MeO toad venom from our local toads and marijuana, which was I want to create this kind of like secular temple on my, not necessarily secular, let's say like non-denominational temple on one of my properties. And I had this idea of like having a camera in the temple, and people go and they express in interesting ways their devotion to, let's just say, divinity, to be very broad and pluralistic about it, in the direction of the camera. That is not to say that the camera itself is God, etc., but in the direction. There's a camera, you're there, you are performing some type of devotional practice, whether that's song or dance or whatever it might be. And this gets consistently nonstop live streamed to the world, which then allows people to try to take a turn of seeing from a quote unquote first person perspective what it would be like to be God, which is I think this is a kind of a big idea with lots of implications and questions it brings up. And I'm not even saying it's a good idea. It might be a very bad idea. I was pretty high, so it might be a very bad idea that I had while I was high once. But it just, the kinds of like questions it was bringing to mind as I was thinking about the idea were very interesting, which is like, what does it mean for us to, see the divine in each other? And how do we create the opportunities for us to do that? It's a very hard thing to do. I think it very rarely even happens in a church, for instance. It very rarely happens in a relationship, in a domestic relationship, for instance. The places where you might see the most opportunity, it's not happening. Could the network, so to speak, and the media, the network of media, help us perform that function of seeing the divine in each other, and in ourselves, for that matter, in a way that we maybe desperately need to. I don't know. It's just a crazy thought, but I thought I'd share it. It's just crazy enough for the net.
Absolutely. Yes. So there's a few things. First, what you were saying about the small town. There can be a certain idealism, a certain kind of, the magicalness, especially when people lose their belonging and they're longing for their belonging. They become kind of nostalgic or see things. The same way, honestly, people will see going back to church or being in a lived community or different things because they want belonging. They feel, so they're looking for that. The issue is many people, like when I go back to say, the 2010s, where deconstruction, Gungur, all these different things. Why were a lot of people leaving the church? Because of stuff happening in the church. They were being hurt by other members of the church, right? It wasn't like like Richard Dawkins made a bunch of religious people, leave church. Of course, that had an impact. But a lot of what happened is people were in the church that couldn't handle difference, that got blown apart by Black Lives Matters or social issues. And then people just didn't want to be in an environment with that tension. So they left. And you can forget, and you see the reason why I bring this up is it's really important to remember, in my opinion, the history clearly, because there was a problem there that hasn't been addressed. If everyone just starts going back to church or going back to religion or stuff like that, the day will come when a culture war issue will show up and blow it all up again. And you see, likewise, people go back. Why did people leave the small town? Because there wasn't creativity. A lot of people didn't have creativity. They couldn't philosophize. They felt stuck. There was opportunity elsewhere, right? So they left. I'm thinking about books like Coming Apart by Murray. I'm thinking about The Brain Drain. I'm thinking about these different things. So you have to create a new infrastructure and new social imagination and new habits that I think the social coordination mechanism makes possible so that people can actually get what they were looking for in the small town that wasn't there, that made them leave. To help people have the capacities in the church that were not there during the culture war, so everyone blew up. They weren't ready for it, right? If you don't address it, you're just now in the fourth turning phase where people are longing for the first turning again, to use that. Like they're longing for the return to the good, like the happy, the vision, and they're recognizing the need for belonging, recognizing the need for values and beauty and so on and so forth. But if you don't develop new habits, new capacities, new coordination capacity, then you're just going to fall right back into it when you get to the next third to fourth turning sort of phrase, right? And so the next phase of deconstruction. So creating new social coordination mix is really, really important. And to me, again, what and Mr. Satori has a wonderful section talking about opportunities in small towns that are there that people don't even look to and different things. And again, with the social coordinate, I can have a conversation with you just like this, all of you wonderful people, which then also opens up doors to people moving places, meeting, like entire new ways of coming together are made possible by that. And then I can get off this and be on Rustburg, Virginia, and go deal with a wedding venue. This was not possible in history. So you can have rhizomatic community in the way Deleuze was talking about. You can have small town that is cosmolocal, as Michelle Bowens would say, that then also allows people to say, get used to pluralism and difference so that they're not fragile to it. So when they encounter difference inside their lived community, their Lions Club, their church or whatever, they don't blow up and ruin the entire thing. And to me, there is a whole lot of, I keep saying Manhattan Project. Michelle and I absolutely think about using this technology and the kind of experimentation to show, to model a different way of life while also participating in the internet, but the small farm. That is so much of what we think about. Like, how do you use the technology? Like, and that's where also we make big distinctions between, say, just the internet and the social coordination mechanism. Because when you think of the social coordination mechanism as the fullness of the internet, that is tied to modeling and coordinating and showing different ways of life and not making technology the enemy. Like there's all that talking like, well, technology is the enemy. It's the bad thing. No, it is not. It is a multiplier of you. It's either going to multiply and make things worse or make things better based on what you do with it, right? And there's kind of a demonization of these different things. The same technology that could be leading to the Nickland singularity is the very technology that opens up a social coordination mechanism that deals with problems in human history that could never be dealt with before. And who knows what could be opened up with the network effects across the world and with different people because of it. And I think it is tied to actually the economic system managing to have growth that is not at the expense of human beings for return on capital. I will pause and throw it to Mr. Satori. Anyone? Mr. Satori, please.
Well, the conversation went many places since I first put up my little hand raising thing.
It's fun. It's fun.
Yeah. Oh, I will point out this because I did with what Christian was saying in this book here, Tenths Before Temples, chapter 38, the Tectonic Temple, which I, received kind of a waking vision while I was reading actually a book, Hans Ruckmacher's Art Needs No Justification, which very much touches on a lot of these aspects of creativity. So thinking about like the community that I spent a long time at was very much one where, for the sake of the protecting the need to nurture, to receive nurture and friendship and community, I had to suppress my desire to grasp for equality with God. And didn't realize it at the time, but it just meant that all these thoughts that I would have thoughts, and I would realize I can't express these thoughts. So that's not good. That's not the kind of thing you want. But I was just thinking, go back to the data centers and all that stuff. And this is just like an example. How, wanting to connect with people, on what basis? If you have a culture that does not tolerate a lot of diversity of opinion, you will be put into if it's the mainstream, whatever's popular, whatever we have less of this than we used to, because the internet has affected even like streaming TV is so much different from cable TV versus network TV. So people already are more niche, but it's like, okay, well, if that's your interest, you have no way to control if you're going to have a conversation. You could have the deepest conversation about the most banal, media with the right person. But how do you find that person? That's difficult. So you have to kind of put your parameters out there to find more niche things. And so I had thought about this. This was a somewhat strategic move I made a little while ago. Looking at the classic books and literature. That is a very well mapped area. There's a huge canon. You could pick a century or a millennia or whatever, and all of it. You will find people. There's a lot of strong opinions. If you don't know all the stuff, you will be told why you have anything that comes out of your head. There's an answer to why it's wrong. So that's frustrating. Maybe what you want to look at, like film. People have a lot of opinions about that. I thought, what is the place where something is like high class and interesting, but you don't hear a lot of people talk about it, and it's opera. Yeah. So opera, it was super. You don't have the film that you have without it, but once you got film, it basically was obsolete because it's so much more work to put on an opera. But it's thinking about like, okay, here's something where it's like I can get into knowing this more, and there's less opinions on it. So if it's like, if you want to analyze a story that's in an opera, you have a lot more freedom to like draw parallels and connections to other things because it's just not talked about as much. So been looking into that stuff, but the problem is that like there's not that much stuff out there, honestly. Like if you go to YouTube's my first stop if I want to learn something. Put YouTube. So if you put in you will find lots of things in YouTube, but most of the time, what you'll find for opera is you'll just find people dressed in tuxedos playing the instruments. You'll find the music. The music's what we have. There are some. There's lots of full operas on there too. They're it's not bad. You can watch them with subtitles, so that's good. So you can just read along. It's kind of like a little tedious because it's like an hour's worth of material that takes 4 hours to sing. But what I was looking for, I'm like, well, I want to know, like, I wanted some sort of a summary. What is going on? What is this thing? So, like, it took an interest in Richard Wagner and his idea of the Gesamtkunstwerk, the complete work of art, and which is just super interesting because it's like this is the idea of having like that immersive experience, which is his so influential. Like all movie scores are based off of his ideas and everything. The fact that we have like dark theaters instead of having them all brightly lit and ornamented, that was his idea. So and looking at like, oh, I wanted to see, because he wrestled with some pretty important stuff in his lifetime and then ended his career on a more positive note. So I wanted to see like, what is the progression of like his journey, the stories he was telling. But you can't find like a lot of really good summaries. Like you can go on Wikipedia and you can read the plot. That's not the most engaging way to do it, but like I found like a few decent videos where somebody was like explaining the plot. I'm like, where do I do that? And then for somewhere I was like, I can't find it. Oh, well, now we have these things, these tools with AI or whatever. So I download the full text, the official libretto, all the words and the thing, put it into the Notebook LM. I had it make a podcast, listen to that, and I had to make a video. So now I got a 5-minute video. I just put it on my channel. So now, so that's AI turning into more digital streaming video, but like made a 5.5-minute video about the opera Tannhauser. And it's right now, it's the best video that explains what Tannhauser's about in 5 minutes on YouTube, as far as I can tell. I don't know, how long it'll get up into the search results or whatever. But, but from that point, like like if I'm going to go meet somebody that wants to go to the opera, like opera tickets are expensive. They only play certain random things, like in your city. It's kind of hard, whatever. But if I can get somebody to watch a 5-minute video and say, that's actually a cool story, and then be like, oh, well, maybe I'll read the book. You can just read it as a book, or maybe I'll watch the full opera on YouTube or something, like 3-4 hours, whatever. That's manageable if you're interested in something. And it's more interesting once you know the gist of the story, because you're not lost. So you do something like that. And then it's like, okay, so then it's like, now I'll have more people to talk to about this. And then eventually I'll find the person who sees how the new Gesamtkunstwerk is professional wrestling. So when we can find the person that we can talk about opera, the connections between opera and professional wrestling, like that's going to be, finding that person is like, that is very hard in a small town. So, but on the internet, it's possible. It's out there. So I don't know. So yeah, some of these ways, these things can work, but even what that takes is, it takes thinking about the fact of like, what is the weirdest part about my brain that I want to find in somebody else to connect to. And it's like the connection between opera and wrestling, and so people, working to identify that in yourself or whatever will increase the likelihood that you have those connections. And maybe that's just the thing, it's like how like people are just afraid to admit that that's what they want to talk about, or not many people want to talk about that, but something equally weird and some equally strange combination of different things. So
that's magnificent. That is all 100%. So that also, it should also be noted, and then alas, I will have to run to get the wedding venue together. If I and social are connected, like what we are is tied to how we are socialized, then social coordination is also in a sense self-creation, or it is tied to the kind of being you are. And there's been a lot of emphasis on like making I think rugged individualism at the expense of the social. Now, that's not always what people mean, but if we take that as a notion, that also follows from the lack of a social coordination mechanism by which the individual can be developed more effectively with the social. So there's a kind of metaphysical value of the individual to make up for the lack of an infrastructure that's trying to kind of meet the historic moment that is not able to effectively have self-development correspond with social development, because you got to be able to find those people and have a realistic way to bring together people interested on the connection between opera and wrestling, because you intuit there's something there, you think it's there, but you're not sure. You need other people to test it. Like, let me, how earlier we were saying there's such thing as bad creativity, right? Sam was emphasizing that, and he's completely correct. Exactly what you're working on, Christian. So the issue is, like, why is the pricing mechanism a big deal? Why is the market a big deal? Because you can compete, you can test, you can try things, right? So let me put it this way. Productivity has a means of testing that then makes it effective, and then growth reflects productivity at the expense of the creative problematically. Creativity has not had an effective means of testing because that requires social coordination, because creativity tends to be tested more via expression, whereas productivity is tested more through competition. Now, expression leads to competition, but you have to find people, like, what I mean by that, in creativity, the effort to express your intuition is the struggle, because you sense it and, like, what do you think? And they say, no, I don't know about that. So the expression has a refining element to it, but you need social coordination for that. Whereas productivity competition is usually a product, I think it's better than yours. There's nothing to express. The thing is done. And now we're going to see which product the consumer wants. That is a testing, but it's a step after creativity. Competition and a refinement in the creative process is more found in the struggle of expression, the struggle of working out, and you need other people to do it. And in history, we haven't been able to effectively coordinate because here's the problem. The more creative your idea, the more difficult it is to find people to talk about it. But the more creative your idea, the more value potential it has, by definition. Now, maybe it has none because it's too creative and therefore it doesn't make sense. But the more creative something is, the more value potential it has. But the more difficult, by definition, it is to find people to test it with, because that's difficult. You need a mechanism of social coordination to increase that effective setting up of the testing. And we haven't had that technology, and now we freaking do. And thus, creativity has been more likely to be untested and ineffective, and therefore the emphasis has been on productivity. But the problem is productivity eventually is low-hanging fruit that runs out, or it narrows and it becomes concentrated. So everything because it's like other, and Hegel, and all of that different thoughts. And I think also the example of making the summary of the opera, like, that's an example of AI and social coordination mechanisms. That's a really big deal. And here's the issue. If you make that video and somebody sees that and goes, that's pretty cool, then then maybe they watch the opera, the likelihood that person is open to whatever opera happens to be in their locality goes up. Like, anything that it goes up. And let's say they go to that opera in their locality and it sucks. They are less likely to take their experience as a final judgment on opera, because that's a major problem. Like, you get people to finally try philosophy or finally try this reading group in your locality, and they do it and they don't like it and it doesn't go well. And so they're like, I knew it. I knew I was wise not to spend my time on this because it went bad, right? Because they have limited exposure. So there's actually there can be a giant risk to expose somebody to something new who hasn't had low-grade exposure before that. So if they've seen some opera online because of AI work that you've done, then if they go to opera in real life, which will be logistically restrained by their lived scenario, the money and all of that, and it's not a good experience, they're still more likely to try again and to not take it as a final judgment on all opera. And that is a very, very big deal. The internet lowers the probability that people pass final judgment on new things because they have more experience of it. They know that not all opera is bad. It's just that this particular opera show in their particular locality was not good, and they're more likely to say, we'll try next time, we'll try again next time, or we'll go to the one in Charlottesville. So by having people do, here's the issue. By having people do new things, this is what I'm getting at. By having people do new things in real life without proper exposure to the new things beforehand, they're actually more likely to not do the new thing because the probability of the random show in your locality being awesome is not high, right? It's not as high as it could be. So then probability theory would say that the exposure to new things in your locality, more times than not, are probably going to lead you in the direction of thinking that thing is a waste of time. And since you have limited exposure, you're likely to take that as a final judgment and never do it again. And in the same way, if you have new theological ideas in your church, and it's the first time you've encountered them, and you don't have the internet by which to explore them, they make you anxious, they make you nervous, and then that guy who exposed it to us can't walk us through the ideas, or maybe he doesn't have the verbal skills or whatever. Therefore, it's evidence to them that new theology is bad, it doesn't do anything good, and they take that as a final judgment, and now insular keeps out the other, and you have major problem. So internet exposure increases the threshold of people to try things and to not pass final judgment on something new after they do it for the first time. And is it not the case that so many people in life, they say, okay, I'll try that thing, they do, and it doesn't go well, it's not as awesome, and you find yourself, no, I'm telling you, philosophy can be fun, no, opera can be good, okay, and they never do it again, right? The internet can help with this problem big time. And that, because if they see people talking online about philosophy and theology and they take a philosophy class and it sucks, they're less likely to think that, therefore, philosophy sucks. Just that one instance of it was bad. So they're now more open, right? And if you don't increase the threshold of openness, you get in trouble. I really need to go to the venue. But so overall, because some other things were said, this would be my overall. So there is absolutely the possibility, I think Christian was pointing to this, that AI, so the thing that we've been pointing to is that R is greater than growth, rates of return on capital. It is possible that if growth narrows into AI, for example, that the extremity of the return on R leads to the government passing a policy where everyone has stock in AI, for example. Therefore, everyone has capital. Therefore, you can deal with the problem of R being higher than G by increasing the number of people in R, right? So you could do that. Right? Now, my issue, that's basically the, because basically what I want to argue is that the social coordination mechanism is what you want, is a good thing to do, even if somehow R over growth expands non-zero sumness without dealing with economic incompleteness. Because that's what people would argue with me, like McCloskey and everything. They say, well, actually, AI is going to force transformation that will make everyone invested in capital and therefore deal with the problem. And the issue I'd say with that is if everyone is at home and they have a lot of free time and they haven't done training with dealing with people or learning skills or whatever, their marriages are going to fall apart. Things are not going to go apart. Like if AI releases you to be more social and to be more free, this gets into psychoanalysis, that freedom will destroy you because you don't have training. But if it is the case that I think that R cannot be expanded adequately to include everyone. Therefore, the only way to deal with our socioeconomic situation is to increase G, is to have G greater than R, and you can only do that with creativity. And then the argument is you can only do that with the architecture of a social coordination mechanism. So either way, even if capitalism via R over G creates the conditions of somehow having everyone get return on capital because of government policy, or everyone's forced to invest in the AI companies, or UBI or whatever, which are just different forms of return on capital being expanded, which I question because we've seen that done and it doesn't seem to work. So no, but it depends. Even in that situation, you're going to want to have gone through the training of the SCM to deal with then freedom, to then deal with where are you going to find meaning in, like, what are you going to do with your time if it's not at work, if you don't find your identity in that, right? You're going to have to do it a new way. And you're going to have to do it together with others if it is actually going to be tested and more likely to create value than not, right? So in that situation, you want the SEM. And then if it's the case that R is greater than G and R is not expanded to include everyone, then you need the social coordination mechanism. So G reflects creativity and economic incompleteness. So either way, I think it is a paradigm. It is necessary for our moment. I appreciate, I will go on full chairs. I'm so sorry, but I have greatly appreciated seeing everyone this day. Thank you for everything. Christian, Mrs. Satoy, Daniel, really appreciate you being here. And may you have a wonderful evening and all the best to you. Thank you all.